Good evening. My name is Brian Konkol. I serve as Dean of Hendricks Chapel and Professor of Practice at Syracuse University, and welcome to Matters That Matter. This is an online conversation series where we amplify intentional conversation about religion, spirituality, values, belief, and motivation. We invite guests to share about choices made, difficulties encountered, and commitments solidified. This evening, our guest is the Reverend Canon Naylor Cope, who serves as Provost of the Washington National Cathedral. The Washington National Cathedral, which serves the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, is often regarded as the spiritual home for the nation and a trusted voice of moral leadership in times of national significance. As its provost, Cope advances the mission of the cathedral through preaching, teaching, stewardship to ensure its role as a house of prayer for all. She is also adjunct professor of preaching at Wesley Seminary, guest preacher and speaker around the world, and contributing meditation writer for the Bible Challenge. Prior to ordained ministry, she served as Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel in the White House and as president of the J. Naylor Cope Company. Welcome to Matters That Matter, Reverend Canon Naylor Cope. It's so good to be with you.
Great to be with you, Dean.
I love listening to people's story of call, about the twists and turns and about how they found themselves where they are today. And your story, Provost Cope, is an absolutely wonderful one. As I just alluded to a moment ago, you began your career with a variety of positions in financial development, consulting, fundraising positions. And then in 1989, you became Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel in the George H.W. Bush White House. Then after serving as president of the J. Naylor Cope Company, you discerned this call to ministry, were ordained in 2007, and then the rest, they say, is history. Could you please share about these twists and turns and about what sparked and sustained this vocational turn into ministry? I'm sure we'd all love to know.
Well, let's just say God's world isn't necessarily linear, and I'm living proof of that. My call is something that came, I guess, somewhat unexpectedly. I'd grown up in the church, in a little teeny mission church in a little teeny town in South Texas, and it was an Episcopal church, and I had every job one could have in that church simply because there weren't very many people, so now I got choosy, including being the church organist when I was in high school. And again, Dean, not like Hendricks Chapel, I was the organist not because I was good, but because I was free.
Yes.
The church does have a way of doing that. And I stayed really pretty actively involved in church. I hope your Syracuse students won't listen to this part. The only part of my life when I wasn't a pretty regular and active churchgoer was in undergraduate school, but I'm confident everyone listening is an exception to that phenomena.
Oh, yes.
And then, as you've articulated in a way that would make my deceased parents blush, and your kindness and your generosity, I stayed very involved in church and had all sorts of leadership positions at what was my home church, St. John's Lafayette Square, which has certainly been in the news a little more recently for reasons we don't need to get into. And it's almost been 20 years, but about 20 years ago, I discovered I had breast cancer. And I was very blessed because it was caught early. And I don't think one can go through that sort of experience in their life if they're a person of faith and not being a little more intentional about one's prayer life. And that was certainly true for me. It wasn't why me. It was really much more, so how would you like me to use this? It was a different sort of inquiry. And what really started to get my attention was when I was receiving radiation treatment as part of my protocol for the cancer treatment. I was sitting in a waiting room, just, in a hospital gown like everyone else, minding my own business, usually reading or just being quiet and still. And people just started getting up from across the room and coming and sitting next to me. I didn't know these people, but they looked at me and they said, you seem really peaceful and I'm terrified. How can you be that way? And it just opened up some opportunities for me to talk a little bit about my faith. And it happened over and over and over again in a way that I couldn't, it was just weird. And so when I completed my radiation treatment, I went on a silent retreat and I asked God, so what's all that about? And I sensed on the retreat, in my spirit, God saying something to the effect of, I have more for you to do. And not being totally irreverent, but looking for clarity, I said, well, that's wonderful. It's great news, but could you be a little more specific? More is pretty broad. And more seriously, it was on that retreat that I sensed a call to ordained ministry. It wasn't something that I previously thought about, but it was something that was a very clear call. And so my husband, John, was incredibly supportive. No one that's close to me fell over laughing when I shared that with them. And you know the rest.
Well, and part of this rest, if you will, is the Washington National Cathedral, where you find yourself now, which both literally and metaphorically is one of the most visible pulpits, not just in the country, but in the world. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the role of the cathedral and the way you see that role here today, that here it is within the Episcopal Diocese and also this spiritual home for the nation. Provost Cope, could you share a little bit more about this intersection between the sacred and civic life that is the historic mission of the cathedral and how you see that mission today and your particular role in that?
Sure. Well, it sounds like a little bit of more than a little bit of hubris to refer to ourselves as a spiritual home for the nation, but part of that actually comes from our founding. Most people don't know that we were actually created by an act of Congress in 1893. And as Congress they created us, but they certainly didn't fund us. This cathedral fit into the plan for Washington, the city and the nation. The city was designed by Pierre L'Enfant, and he laid out Pennsylvania Avenue was supposed to be like our Champs-Élysées. The clear sight lines of Congress and the White House and the Supreme Court, all the branches of government line up along that axis. And because of Notre Dame and because of those traditions, L'Enfant called for a church to be built for national purposes. And it was really out of that original design that the notion of a church for national purposes came into being. And so fast forward a bit, a foundation stone for the cathedral was laid in 1907. And on that day, Teddy Roosevelt came. There were 10,000 people. Some came from London, etc., all with this great vision of a house of prayer for all people, really. And Teddy Roosevelt on that day said, "Godspeed the work begun this day." And so for the first 100 years of the cathedral, it was really about building this Gothic building and being a place, certainly during the World Wars and subsequent times of great celebration and great sorrow in our nation. People have come to the cathedral, and that is obviously continued to this day. But some of your students, because I look at Hendricks Chapel and how you reach out to all the faith traditions and that you welcome all. We too try to do that. We are rooted obviously in the Episcopal tradition. We are a branch of Christianity. But for our national services, we are very intentionally both interreligious and ecumenical. In the 1960s, for example, then Dean Sayer opened up portions of the cathedral for different Orthodox churches who were building their church buildings, but they weren't constructed yet. A lot of people don't know that in Bethlehem Chapel, which was the original oldest part of the cathedral, Temple Sinai congregation worshiped here on Fridays for years while they were getting their synagogue built. For those who have seen presidential prayer services or some of those larger events, they're very decidedly interreligious and ecumenical. So that was our founding. I think the challenge for us in the next 100 years is now that we have this beautiful Gothic building, still has some earthquake damage, but that's okay. We're able to function. And I think that our brokenness and woundedness is a good metaphor for our world. So that doesn't bother me in the least. It's how to use this gift we've been given. How do we help to be, particularly in our time, healers of the breach, as Isaiah talks about, repairers of the breach. And so we bring together, as you know, different sorts of conversations and convening with people who hold disparate views on the issues of our day, probably not unlike what you're doing with Matters That Matter. And we are a regular worshiping community every day. And we can talk more about that if you have interest, but I hope I answered your question.
Well, it's wonderful for you to share about the cathedral itself. And I think about your particular role as provost in this high profile position around being a teacher, being a preacher, being an administrator, being an author, being an organizer, being someone who's working on development. I'm curious about these different roles that you serve at the cathedral, and how do these different roles feed into each other? And perhaps maybe sometimes how do these roles conflict with one another, or perhaps are in tension with one another? Could you share a little bit more about that, please?
That's a great question. I should ask you that question, good Dean. But
we agreed you would do 95% of the talking for this program, so I'm gonna stick you to it.
Nope, no problem. What I would say is that they all do fit together. I think part of what's always at my core is that first and foremost, I am a person of faith and I am an ordained minister. And everything I do really comes from that lens. Whether I'm writing or teaching or preaching or running meetings or, administering and supervising different areas of the cathedral, it is from that lens. It reminds me a little bit, C.S. Lewis said something to the effect that I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun is risen, not only because I see it rise, but because by it, I see everything else. And that's, I think, how I view those things. And of course, when one's done research for teaching or writing, it always has a way of making its way into your sermon. Whatever one's reading tends to make its way into a sermon or one's writing. God doesn't hopefully let us waste anything. In terms of any tension, of course, there's always making sure one does the best they can with a really crowded schedule, which now seems to be populated by nonstop Zoom meetings for a lot of us. It's sort of like Hollywood Squares all day, is to make sure that one has carved out enough time to do the thoughtful, prayerful work of being a minister, the pastoral pieces, the preaching pieces. You know this from your own experience, but sermon preparation is serious business, and it takes time. It takes a lot of research, a lot of thought, and a tremendous amount of prayer. And your students might be interested to know that the common rule of thumb is that a preacher spends 1 hour of preparation for each minute preached. And so being faithful to the matters that matter is really important. That we're in a good place, that we're staying close to God, to do the things we believe we've been called to do.
When you talk about the sense of calling, one of the things that I find fascinating, challenging, is you talk about your role that is so unique there at the cathedral and the ways in which you're bringing people together at a time when it's so tempting to turn on each other. The cathedral intends to help people to turn towards one another, which I can assume is challenging in the year 2020. And could you share a little bit more about, in the midst of these divisive times and about convening on important issues, what does that look like in terms of your preparation? Because you're clearly very intentional about having ground to stand on, saying this is where we stand, and also everyone's welcome to have this conversation. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. I start from, and I would say this is true of the cathedral, from the premise of the inherent good in each one of us. And as a Christian, I'm very mindful of Jesus' teaching and remembering that he was a Jew. So it all ties together. But most notably, I think in his Sermon on the Mount, when he instructed us to turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, love our enemies, and pray for those who persecute us. That's a tall order for all of us. But it's a way of love. If you peel everything else away, the one thing that is more powerful than fear or hate is love. And if we can agree on that, then we have somewhere to go, And I also believe not just in the inherent goodness in each and every one of us, but deep down deep, that really is what we desire for one another. All of the faith traditions have some sense of the golden rule. And I think that if you can appeal to what connects us in the common ground and do it out of a place of knowledge and respect, then you can have a conversation. And one of the things that we try to do at the cathedral is to offer a safe and a brave space where people feel, all of us tilt, from time to time, but that we can be honest brokers, if you will, and that people aren't going to come here knowing that they're going to be attacked, that there's at least a space to be open and to see about the things that bring us together as opposed to the things that drive us apart.
I need for our viewers watching on Facebook this evening, and also for those that directly access this through the Zoom webinar platform, we do want to invite, if you have a question or a comment for Provost Cope, please feel free to type it into the comments, again, either on Facebook Live or here on the Zoom webinar, and our staff from Hendricks Chapel will receive those and try to get them to me at the earliest convenience. So again, please feel free if you've got some questions, comments, and we'll make sure we get those to Provost Cope here as soon as we can. I wanted to pick up when you talked about the digital reality, and as we do, I of course want to use this time to talk about the inspiration that we at Hendricks Chapel have received from the cathedral. Quite frankly, this program was in many ways inspired by some of the excellent program that you and your colleagues have been doing at the cathedral. So I wanted to publicly thank you for that. And as I think about us at Hendricks Chapel and yourselves at the cathedral, this shift from the in-person experience to these online, which also shifts your audience from, here's this group that might be your congregation, if you will, or for us, our campus community. And all of a sudden people are tuning in online from California or from Brazil or from Argentina or from South Africa. And I'm curious about what this shift has looked like to you, for where you, shall we say, balance this online ministry with those who were with you before COVID-19. Could you share a little bit more about what that's looked like for you? Because from an outsider perspective, it looks like you're all doing it really well, but I'm sure it's a lot more complex than I perceive it to be.
You are incredibly gracious. We are flying and building the ship at the same time. At any rate, it has been really extraordinary. So just to give you a sense of that, we're in the dog days of August. And when the cathedral was open, we might have had on the main service on a Sunday, maybe 600 people, maybe. And I don't know, I think we had over 12,000 worshiping with us live last Sunday. And on average, 43,000 people will worship with us. Some live, and then they pick it up during the week. Our weekday services that we do, before, when we did like a 7:30 a.m. Eucharist on a Wednesday, the same faithful 12 people would come. And we offer morning prayer every morning now. It's taped in advance, but 1,400 people all across the country at 7 a.m. Who does that? And across the world are joining with us. You just referenced Facebook. Our Facebook engagement since the pandemic is up 3,000%. Our Facebook followers up 1,000%. And part of what that tells me, Dean, is people are longing for connection and relationship and a place where they will find spiritual nourishment and a sense of hope in the midst of, incredibly difficult and complex times. To your question about how does that sort of change preaching and outreach, et cetera, That's a really astute question because it changes it in very specific ways. So before, we had a regular, even online community in our regular sort of worshiping community, but we always had a lot of tourists and visitors, etc. So um, you had to be aware that it was more of a national type of message than a parochial type of message. And this has just made that exponentially more the case. When one has a regular worshiping community, they get to know you and trust you. And so if you start to push on the edges a bit, you do so knowing that even if you annoy people, you know, that they know where you're coming from and they give you the benefit of the doubt. With preaching into a camera now, knowing it's going to, 40,000 people, you have no idea who they are, and what their knowledge of scripture or any of that is. And so you can't take things for granted, and you have to be much more intentional on how you lead people into a service, how you lead people into a sermon, how you lead people into Bible study. I mean, we're doing all of that, but it's all virtual right now. And I will tell you that one of the challenges for me and for my colleagues, because we've talked about it, is when one is conducting a worship service and preaching, you are in relationship with everyone who's in the space with you. And that's particularly true for me in preaching, because I'm looking to see the reaction. And I feel the energy of all the people in the room. And if I start to see people, doing this, I know I need to, shift or something. When people are really starting to get antsy or they're, daydreaming, you can see that and feel that. But for example, the last time I preached, I'm looking directly into a camera way up on a stone pillar in the cathedral, and I cannot see one living person. And so all the energy has to come from you. And the way that I work with that is in my heart and in my mind's eye, I picture the people I know and all the people I don't know, but who are, giving up their time just in the desperate hope that they're going to hear something that will be encouraging, that they will hear something to help carry them into the week, that they will hear something that helps take them from this place to this place, ready to face the next day or the next week or whatever it is. And so if you can hold that in your heart and in your spirit, then you're not preaching into a camera. But it's definitely a shift. And for all of us who, have the privilege of preaching, we have to be very mindful of that as we put our sermons together. I hope I didn't ramble on.
Wonderful. And some of the questions, and again, for our viewers on Facebook, and we also have some here on the Zoom webinar, this connected directly. We got a question from James and asked about how COVID-19 has impacted church and the outreach. I think you've clearly talked about that. We've gotten some affirmation here. Kathleen's talking about your wonderful job connecting on your sermons. And I'd love to follow that portion here, is that in the midst of the challenges, Provost Cope, that you just described about speaking into a camera, if you will, you have not hesitated to preach about, shall we say, matters that matter. And as we think about right now, this context of preaching and content of preaching and this dynamic relationship, my sense is that you have engaged very intentionally with two different pandemics. One pandemic that's been going on for a few months now, COVID-19, and another pandemic that's been going on for hundreds of years, the pandemic of racism. More specifically, your July 19th sermon, which I just deeply, deeply appreciate, you spoke about something which you titled as white soul work as a person that passes as white. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that sermon and that terminology and what it is that you were hoping to connect with in that moment. Because I think for myself personally, and I imagine that for many others, that was very powerful and something, some work that clearly needs to continue.
Thank you. Well, Dean, I need to give credit to another Dean, my Dean, for couching the term white soul work. He had preached about that, and he's a native of Virginia. I'm a native of Texas. And I think to not address what is going on all around us, we would just be tone deaf. I think it was Karl Barth who said that preachers should preach with the Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other. And I think people also come to church or, a mosque or a synagogue or whatever, hoping that someone will help them interpret and navigate the times we live in. And when our presiding bishop, and this is also the seat of Michael Curry, a lot of people know about Michael Curry because he preached at the royal wedding. And he preached Easter at the cathedral virtually. 55,000 people worshiped light. It crashed our system. But at any rate, he at Pentecost, he also preached. And it was a few days after George Floyd was murdered. And as an African American, of course, he had to speak to that. And he talked about the two pandemics, everything related to COVID, not just the health issues, but the obvious social inequities that have been laid to bear. If we didn't see them before, there's no unseeing them now. And the pandemic of racism, which has been with us in this country for 400 years, as you referenced. And he said some important things, many important things, but he talked about how we are not victims of fate because we are people of faith. That we are people who live in hope. But part of that is our responsibility to help to bring hope to others. And when in July, it was my, privilege to preach, of course, there'd been more senseless deaths. COVID, racism, all of it. And all of us, our hearts are breaking, And I was reminded, talk about intimidating. Martin Luther King Jr. preached his last Sunday sermon at the pulpit I was going to go into. And one of the things he said that day, and I commend that sermon to everyone because although it was preached over 50 years ago, it frankly could be preached today. But one of the things that he said that day was that social change, human progress has never rolled in on the wheels of inevitability. That it takes people of goodwill and good faith to do the hard work. And that really resonated with me. that I have my own work to do. I mean, I've been doing it, but I think so many people are, don't know what to do. They want to do something, but what is that something? And they recognize that things are not right. As John Lewis said, when we see something that's not right, not fair, not just, we have to do something. And this was an opportunity for me to say something. And I hoped that in my own personal example, and it's really, preachers have to be careful because the sermon is not about them. And for gosh sakes, don't make yourself the hero and heroine every time you preach. But by my being vulnerable in talking about my experience growing up in a little town in South Texas, Brown versus Board of Education was enacted before I was even born. But it wasn't until I was in about the 5th or 6th grade that my school was integrated. There was a Black school across the railroad tracks, and it was separate, but certainly not equal. And there were things that I remembered, but I was confident there were things that I didn't remember. And I screwed up my courage and called one of my high school friends who was Black. And thanks to Google, you can find anyone these days. And I wasn't even sure she'd remember me or be willing to talk to me. But with God's grace, she did, and she was. And we compared notes. And I was partially correct in my memory, but not all of it. And that was an important lesson for me. And I won't rehash the sermon, but it also then led me to pull out all my high school yearbooks and look at them with a different lens. What do I see now that I didn't see then? Like the fact there was only one Black teacher in my high school. And when I asked my friend, did you remember that there was only one Black teacher? Well, of course she knew that. I mean, I don't remember noticing that, but of course she did. And for the record, there was only one Hispanic teacher too. And so just going back, what was I taught? I know what my parents taught me, and that has stayed with me. They taught me to respect every person, and that every person was worthy of my respect. But what else did I learn? What have I been blind to? And I think that's a question that those of us who are white need to ask. It no longer, if it ever did, works for us to just stand on the side and not be engaged. As Dr. King said, it takes people of good faith and goodwill to do the hard work. And as my Black friends have told me, Jan, this is yours to do, as in you white people. And that's right. And so the sermon was my invitation for other people to begin to think about that if they hadn't, and hopefully to get engaged if they're not. One of the things I was taught by Bobby McLean, one of my homiletics professors at Wesley Seminary, was that at the end of a sermon, everyone ought to be able to answer the question, so what? There should be a charge. And my charge for myself is do the work, do the white soul work, because it is only when we do that we can begin to see the beloved community that God always intended.
You talk about the work, and even 40 minutes into this conversation, we're starting to unpack the different layers of the work of the cathedral and your work as provost. And I think our audience has picked up on this. And one of the questions that comes in from Carol on Facebook is around your own self-care. Carol writes in, she's saying, and I'm paraphrasing, people are depending on you and your team perhaps more than ever before, and there's all these uncertainties and challenges. The question that Carol brings to us is, Provost Cope, how do you recharge? How is that you care for yourself when so much is asked of you so much, especially in times such as these?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the concern it evidences too. Recently, we had I promise this isn't too much of a sidetrack. One of the morning services I did recently was on the feast day of Clare of Assisi, and she formed the Order of Poor Clares, which exists to this day all around the world. And I thought, okay, here are these cloistered nuns. What might they have to teach us about, involuntary isolation for a lot of people? And one of the things they talked about was to make sure that you have a routine, that when things are so chaotic, have a routine. Make sure that each day that you find an opportunity for joy. And maybe it's just ice cream, just something. And obviously prayer. I am blessed with a wonderful husband and dear colleagues at the cathedral. And I realize how fortunate I am to be in a multi-clergy situation. And so we are able to talk freely with one another. But I try to practice what I preach. I get up really early in the morning. I spend quiet time in prayer. I do what we call the daily office and do 4 day by day. They have an app. And so I do that every day. And I go for a walk every morning, about 6 o'clock, and walk about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm not plugged into anything. I try and just be open to whatever God or whomever might have to say to me that day. And it is some of my most valuable prayer time. And that's a sacred practice for me. My early mornings are what ground me for the day. And I'm in much better shape today. I've just come off a 2-week staycation, and just a break from Zoom is incredibly restful. But do the things, we all do the things we know give us joy and sustain and feed us. All of us know what those things are. Do those.
I love what you've shared about, it's actually, this sense of what we can learn from these traditional practices as we think about monasticism and quarantining and these daily practices and disciplines. It's wonderful. I wanted to share, Provost Cope, just lots of words of affirmation coming in. Sylvia, Mary, Jessica, Carol, looks like these are all folks who have experienced the cathedral either in person, online, and so it looks like you've got a healthy source of supporters out there. These conversations, we could always go on and on and on and on. And I only have one more question for you for the sake of time, and we promised to be done right around this time. Is we thinking about this time of crisis that we find ourselves in, and the title of this program is Matters That Matter. And when we bring these two together, we think about the ways in which crisis can help to clarify matters that really matter. I'm wondering, Provost Cope, if you could speak to our students and to think about what are you hoping might clarify for them during this really important time? And again, we want to thank you for being with us this evening. So we'll give you the last word.
Oh, Dean, thank you. For your students, follow your passion in your heart. I think one of the two best definitions of vocation that I know, one is from Frederick Buechner, who describes vocation as that place where your heart's deep passion meets the world's great need. You know what you're passionate about. Get engaged if you're not. And I've looked on Hendricks Chapel website. There are plenty of ways that you can be engaged, whether it's the food pantry or other things, to reach out in your Syracuse community and more broadly. The other is by the Quaker Parker Palmer, who said that vocation is not so much a goal that we seek, but a call that we hear. Listen for that voice and go there. And your life will never be the same. I'm so grateful to you, Dean, for this time, for inviting me. And I hope it's a wonderful academic year for all of you at Syracuse. You're an important institution in this country. Know that I pray for you. 23,000 students is a lot of students. And they're all under your spiritual care. So you have a big role yourself and an important one. But I'm grateful to people who've taken the time to sit and listen to the two of us, really more me. Sorry about that.
Oh, this is great.
But I just thank you all.
Thank you, Provost.
Stay safe out there.
Thank you so much. And it looks like the lights are going down here in my office, and the lights are going down on this program for this evening. For all of you that have tuned in, we'll make sure that we get some information, if we haven't already, about the National Cathedral. It's an absolute pleasure. It's a gem, especially in times such as these. And we want to thank everyone for being here with us. Any follow-up questions, comments, please feel free to type them into the comments there on Facebook, or send us an email at chapel@syr.edu. Thank you so much for being with us. We ask that you stay healthy, stay hopeful. Good night, and God bless. Thank you.